I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for coming to the Conservation Council ACT Region Election 2024 Forum. Thank you for all attending, and thank you to our four candidates for agreeing to talk tonight. We really appreciate it. First, as a very brief introduction of myself, and I'll be chairing the event tonight. So my name is Simon Copland, and I'm the new Executive Director at the Conservation Council ACT. I've been here since early August, so a month and a half, still getting my head around this, and it's nice to launch in with a big event and an election campaign straight off the bat. So welcome everybody. Of course, what we're going to do is I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction. We'll then go to our candidates. Each will have a 10-minute opportunity to present their pitch, answering a question, and then we've got a whole range of questions that have already been pre-asked that we'll go through. So bear with me as we get through a little bit of the introduction, and then we can get to the candidates who will be the main stars of the event tonight. So firstly, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Ngarigo peoples as traditional custodians of the land in which we live and work, and extend our respects to all other First Nations people with connection to this region. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that we benefit from stolen country. We recognise, particularly in the environment space, the deep and continuing connection that First Nations people have with land, sea, culture and community. And we are continuously working to striving to stand in allyship with First Nations communities for self-determination and environmental justice. And that's a core part of the work that we do. And I'm sure we'll have some of those conversations tonight. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the Conservation Council and the work that we do, as well as to some of the core issues that we've raised in our election platform before we get to our candidates. So the Conservation Council ACT region is the leading environmental advocacy organisation and representative group for communities in the ACT region. So since 1981, we've been at the centre of the region's most important wins for wildlife, bushland and communities, and we're really the peak organisation that is here fighting for our environment in the ACT. There's a lot that's been happening around the environment and climate in the last 4 years since the last election, and I thought it'd be just really nice to highlight some of the big wins that have been happening in this area. Recent wins, of course, around the climate space have been very important. This is probably not this term, but we've gotten the ACT to 100% renewable energy and commitments to net zero emissions, which are integral. And we in the ACT, I think we should be proud of leading the country when it comes to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and tackling climate change. The legislation to phase out gas has been one of the big victories that we have been really proud of here as well. And the rollout plan for that is something that we're going to continue working on. But we're also really happy with a lot of the nature protection that is happening at the moment as well. The recent announcement of the protection or the decision to turn Blewett's Block into a nature reserve is one that we think is extremely important. We'll obviously be keeping an eye on that to ensure that it's the best nature reserve possible, that has the best management and protection possible, but it is certainly a big win. We've also been working heavily on the Lawson grasslands issue, which many of you may be aware of. We've had some significant wins there in terms of that was around a development from DHA, the Housing Authority, Federal Housing Authority, and we've successfully seen that development significantly reduced, so it'll have much less impact on that environment and the endangered species there. And another one I think that's really great that's happened recently is a legislated right to a healthy environment that's now part of our Human Rights Act, which is one that we think is really important, which means that within 4 years' time, people will actually be able to take the government to hold the government to account to ensure that a legislated right, that the right to healthy environment is included in all of our decision making and all of our policies, and that it's a central part of our human rights. So these are some of the wins that we've seen here, but I want us to frame this conversation tonight to be thinking about the fact that while the ACT is doing well in some areas on the environment, there's a lot more that we can be doing, and there are a lot of issues that we are still facing. We know, and everyone here coming here tonight is a testament to this, that Canberrans love our environment and want to protect our bush capital. You know, we are the bush capital, and I think it's something we're all very proud of. Something that I'm certainly proud of, having grown up here, and something that really connects to me. But we've got a lot of work to do. Sadly, since 2020, the last election, we've had 5 new species added to the endangered species list. including our bird emblem, and I think one of all of Canberrans' favourite animals, which is the Gangang cockatoo, which is a really sad state of affairs that our bird emblem has been added to a threatened species list here in the Territory, which suggests that there's still a lot of work to be done to protect our environment and to tackle climate change in the Territory. So you may have seen, and part of this work was we have developed an election platform as part to in the lead up to the election, something that we're taking to candidates and to the community as things that we think need to be done for the environment. And there are a couple of areas of concern and areas of things that we would like to see changed. And I just want to run through a few of those, and hopefully they might also provide some prompts for our candidates tonight. So first, I think one of the major concerns that has been continuing to be raised with us is the ongoing destruction of natural habitats and endangered ecosystems, really mostly to facilitate the sprawl of a city, to build unsustainable and unaffordable housing. We feel like this is facilitated in part by poor nature legislation, and that's something that is coming up in the new term of government is a review of nature legislation, one which gives currently too much power to developers to build swathes of sprawling suburbs rather than to protect our nature. And that's something that's really important for us that we'll be working on. We feel as part of that as well that the management of natural habitats is often underfunded, and that we still see the degradation of many of our reserves, which is a real shame. We have a strong reserve system in the ACT, partially because we're a city-state with one really big national park, which is really important, obviously. But often our reserves are still allocated or declared in a really hodgepodge manner. And in fact, we very rarely see new reserves declared. Mostly when it's happening now, it's part of offsets rather than because of a recognition of the inherent natural value of pieces of land. And so part of that is what we're also talking about is the development of what we're calling a biodiversity network, which would properly map, protect, and manage biodiversity across the Territory rather than in a hodgepodge manner. Whether it's on a declared reserve, on leased land, or small patches of trees or grassland down the road that have important biodiversity values that might not make it into the reserve system, we want to be looking at ways to protect that as part of a broader system, a broader network. So they're the kind of big things when it comes to nature that we're really talking about, the nature legislation, the biodiversity networks and management of reserves. And then, of course, on climate change, there's a few core areas as well. Our platform says, we've made great strides on climate change in the Territory. I've already said that. But we still have two major sources of emissions, which is gas and transport. While we've legislated a ban on gas connections by 2035, we want to ensure that there is a strong plan to see that implemented, particularly for those of the lower socio-demographic, lower socio-demographics, because those are the people who can least afford it to be able to make these transitions, but also they're the people who often need it the most, and who are often the ones that are hit by climate change the most and hit by these things the most. And so we're going to continue to be working on how we can do that transition. And the other area is obviously transport. Transport now accounts for over 60% of Canberra's emissions. And while we've done some great stuff in seeing Canberrans take up electric vehicles, we know from all the research and evidence that electric vehicles can't be enough to reduce our transport emissions. And that one of the key things that we need to be doing is seeing investment in public and active transport to ensure that people can get out of their cars and be connected in other ways. And that's something that we'll be continuing to work on. So based on all of those kind of concerns, our election platform is split into 4 areas. And I'll provide some links to this after the event. And that's in climate, biodiversity, transport, and waterways. And I'll just give you a couple of highlights of some of the things that we're asking candidates to commit to this election. So in biodiversity and nature, we're talking about fixing our nature legislation. We're talking about implementing a territory-wide biodiversity network that has a better management of our biodiversity. We want to see commitments to set city limits and stop the sprawl of our city and the destruction of our natural habitat on the edges. And part of that is stopping runaway habitat clearing. We want to see some work to do more to hand over power to First Nations people to be decision makers and stewards in helping protect and enhance our biodiversity. We want to make sure that Blewett's Block and Lawson grasslands are protected in the ways that we're hoping that protection is strong. And we want to protect the western edge of our city, which is currently under investigation for development, which we think would be a bad idea. And on climate, we're looking at having a just transition to phase out gas. We want to have investment in public and active transport. We want to ensure the transition for the phase out of wood heaters, and potentially to bring that ban of wood heaters forward. And we want to see the banning of fossil fuel advertising in sport in particular, which is an area that's still of where fossil fuel companies gain social capital. So that's my brief summary of our election platform, and I'll provide a link to the platform a bit later so you can have a fuller read of it. But really, I want to hand over tonight to our candidates, because it's the candidates here who are here to pitch to you about what they want to do for the environment, and this is an opportunity for us to all grill the candidates and the parties on what they're going to take forward to the election. So we've got 4 excellent candidates who I'll introduce in a minute. But the plan for tonight is we've given the candidates each 10 minutes to present their pitch. And the question that we've just asked for them to respond to is, what will be your main priorities for the environment if you're elected? So we'd like you to respond to that. We've got 10 minutes. And then what we've got is I've got a bunch of questions that people have asked in advance. And so I'll go through those questions. And I reckon, based on the list that we've got, that will probably cover us for the night. But we'll see how we go. If all the candidates are super short, which I have never experienced in my life before, then we can see if there's some from the floor, but I reckon we'll probably cover everything in the first place. I hope that sounds good for everybody. But let's get going. We have 4 candidates tonight. I'll introduce you all, and we've done it the fairest way possible I could think of in alphabetical order. And we'll do the first bit in alphabetical order, and then when we get to the questions, we might shift up the order. So Leanne, you don't always have to go first, and Rebecca, you don't always have to go last. As someone with a name that ends starting with C, I'm also used to having to often go first in these kinds of things. So I respect that, Leanne. Don't want to put you in that position every time. So first of all, our candidates. So we have Leanne Castley, who is the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party and the member for Werribee. And I believe now the kind of spokesperson for the environment, because Nicole Lauder, who was that spokesperson, is no longer running for the election this time. We have Suzanne Orr, who is the environment spokesperson for the ACT Labor Party and also the member for Werribee. We have Vanessa Picker, who is the Independents for Canberra candidate for Brindabella and also a spokesperson for the environment, I think. And Rebecca Vassarotti, who is our current Environment Minister, Deputy Leader of the ACT Greens and member for Kurrajong. So let's get started. And I think, Leanne, that means you're first on the list. And I've got 10 minutes for you on the question of what will be your main priorities for the environment if you're elected. Can you unmute, or do I have to ask you? I think I have to ask you.
There we go. Yes, you have to ask me. Thank you. I promise not to take 10 minutes.
You're fine.
I'm not one of those politicians. Look, yeah, I mean, yes, thank you for the introduction. It's great to see you all so interested in tonight's forum. I am taking over from Nicole as of, I think, yesterday or the day before. So I may not have all of the answers that you need. I've been involved in environment at the beginning of my term. That was part of my portfolios, and it changed pretty quickly when I took over health. So I'll do the best that I can for all of you tonight, and promise to take notes and get back to you if I need to follow up with anything. But look, our plan, the Canberra Liberals plan, is there's 4 main areas, and that's we want to be supporting our environmental groups. I understand the struggle of environmental groups continuing in the work that you do with a significant lack of resources. So we're committing to, enhancing the support that you need. Obviously, protecting our natural environment is key for all of us. There's no doubt we're all interested in that. I think it's important to make sure that our the grassroots environmental groups also know how valued they are. You all do so much work for us out of the goodness of your heart, and so we want to make sure that we're committed to ensuring that you have what you need. So again, I'd love to thank Nicole Lauder. She's spoken to so many groups and been an advocate for so many of Canberrans' environmental groups, and know that you need support. The second thing is caring for wildlife. We've talked about this already. We are the bush capital. Wildlife is so important. We find there's injury, road accidents, all sorts of things that are going on for our wildlife, and it's important that we look at innovative solutions to protect wildlife, especially around our roads. I apologise, I have a new puppy who's just popped outside. Give me a moment. And sustainability. We're looking into, expanding eco-friendly initiatives in our city, and we want to encourage more Canberrans to do that and hop on board. And there is an appetite for an expansion of green spaces, 100%. As I'm out here in Yarrabee, as Suzanne is, so that's for those of you who don't know, I live in Ngunnawal, and we cover Kaleen and Girralang, and now, we need some green spaces out here. There's absolutely no doubt about that, but it's a great way to boost biodiversity and connect communities. We learned that in COVID. We just want to be outside, and so doing what we can for that. So they're the three main points. And really, other than that, I think I'm disappointed in the lack of wildlife support with the current government. I do believe that our community groups, environmental groups, aren't funded well enough. And that's something that we're certainly looking at, seeing how we can change and what adjustments we can make there, should we win government. And community gardening support. I actually door knocked a gentleman in Crace, and my door knocking spiel is, "Hey, I'm Leanne, your local member. Is there anything I can help with in the local area?" He said, "Yep, grab a shovel out of that trailer in the front yard there. I'm just about to hit down." I'm like, okay, look, I can't today, but it's a very practical help that our local community groups need. And so we want to look at how we can do that a little bit better. But, I think the government has been a bit slow on a few of the sustainability practices. But look, that's all I have to say at the moment. So I'm happy to take questions. And as I said, I'm keen to take notes and any questions that I can answer, because I would also love to hear from you.
Great, thanks, Leanne. We'll go through each of the candidates, and then, obviously questions will come. So I think, Suzanne, you are next, and I'll ask you to unmute, and hopefully you can just pop your video on by yourself, but let me know if you need. There you go, you're fine.
Got there, thanks, Simon. So thank you. I'm Suzanne Orr, member for Yarrabee, similar to Leanne, different parties, but same electorate. I'm also the Labor spokesperson for environment. So just with that, it's very much focused on the biodiversity and the conservation side. I have got some very nice talking points from my colleagues who cover climate change and transport, because I know that's a big interest to the Cons Council. But bear with me if I'm not quite as familiar with those parts as I am with the biodiversity and conservation part. So for me, a big part of environment and what I'm looking to do and where Labor's looking to go is to make sure that we are protecting, preserving and also improving our natural landscape within the city. So that's those really precious areas that are really we need to preserve, we need to conserve and improve, that we've got the right balance there, but also within our city footprint, providing options so that we're not becoming a concrete jungle. And I think Simon hit on this quite strongly in his opening remarks, and a key concern we've heard from the Cons Council and from many people across our city is that as we continue to grow as a city, we do it in a way that not only minimises the impacts to the environment, but also provides a great environment for us to live in. So with that in mind, one of the things that ACT Labor will be committing to is establishing an ACT government landscape architect and having an office for the landscape architect to develop a landscape plan. And this is intended to bring together the great work that's already happening, mapping the biodiversity across our city and that's going on in our nature reserves and parks, so that we can better have our natural environment and our built environment speaking to each other and overcoming a lot of the issues and obstacles that we're currently seeing that aren't working for either side. So that will be a big commitment that we'll be making to make sure that we stay the bush capital and a city in a landscape. I can keep running through more, but Simon, tell me when I get the wind up.
You're doing fine so far. You've got plenty of time.
Sure, I'm not going to take 10 minutes if I can help with that one. Look, we also are committed to seeing the statutory review of the Nature Conservation Act done properly with significant consideration, because we recognise that is a piece of legislation that's quite complex, it's quite important, and it really does need a good look and a good review. So we see that as a really good opportunity, and we'll be making sure that we commit to making it modern and fit for purpose. We're also looking to undertake a review of the Environment Protection Authority and the Conservator of Flora and Fauna to make sure that they are best positioned to deliver regulatory responsibilities. I know there's been a little bit of talk around those as to whether they should be independent. For us, the main part is to understand that they can deliver on what their responsibilities are. I'm going to this in a bit more detail when we get to the questions, but we do have some answers to our invasive species and our weeds. That's people are always very impressed when I say, yep, I know what St. John's wort is. So I'll go into those a little bit more in detail because I know we have some questions coming on them. But really, we're also looking at how we can support our community groups. So we will be looking at sustainable funding. I know the Peaks in particular have had a lot to say on this, but we get requests from a number of groups across the environmental areas. So we want to make sure that we actually review that and do it properly, but there is a commitment there to look at the funding to make sure that we are supporting these groups. We're also going to look at putting in more rangers for the urban parks. We know we've had a lot of people getting involved in these and wanting to make sure that we have volunteers, they're supported there, that they've got that coordination there. I've got a few more things. I think they're going to come out as we go through the questions. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail about them now, but certainly happy to have a bit of a chat as we work through the questions. Thanks, Simon.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Vanessa, I think you are next.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I might actually use close to 10 minutes because I think independent voices are often drowned out. So I'm probably going to use that time. I think first and foremost, it's really exciting to be here today and part of this conversation where environmental conservation is very rightly at the forefront. I think too often we don't see that. And I think that, I might be biased, but I think that independent voices like ours are particularly crucial, especially in these areas where we need visionary thinking and quite frankly, we need a lot more progress than what we've seen so far. So we're just really excited to be here today. And, as independents, we have a lot more freedom to really respond to community voices and to community need and to take quite an iterative approach to policy making. So another reason that we're really excited to be here is that we think that this is an ongoing dialogue, which hopefully goes well beyond this event here tonight. So if anybody wants to reach out to Independents for Canberra in general or to myself or any other candidate, we've got candidates across all of the electorates. Feel free to do so to keep the conversation going. So before diving into the specifics, I think, let's just start with the broader context. And we've heard that in many ways we have made some progress. We're making some great strides in some ways, but also I think that we've arrived here needing a really strong voice in this election campaign because the status quo simply hasn't been working. And one example, for example, would be the World Wildlife Fund. They recently released their report. It was about threatened species. They graded the ACT and it wasn't good news. So we saw the largest decrease in both the recovery plan and also protection indicators. So I think while we should celebrate the positives, I do think that, any narrative that suggests that everything's under control and we're meeting all the indicators is simply, it doesn't stack up to the evidence. So we're lagging behind. And I think that, as I said, we need not just visionary ideas, but really long-term thinking, which spans beyond the election cycle. So moving on to our kind of concrete things that we want to do, just to say, actually, there's quite a bit of, there will be overlap with some ideas that the other candidates put forward, because as independents, we think that good ideas and bad ideas can come from all of the different parties. And so where there's a good idea, we like to recognize that and pick that up. But also there's a lot of overlap between with the election platform, which I think is really good to see. So I think, we're all kind of moving in the same direction. But first and foremost, I think increase in long-term funding for environmental organizations, and especially community organizations. So as was mentioned before, it's really important to recognize the really critical role played by local environmental and sustainability organizations, organizations like Sea Change, the Conservation Council ACT region, Canberra Environment Centre. I could go on. There are so many examples of really fantastic grassroots work. And, I think that we can't really, commit to these metrics and to things that we want to do without funding the grassroots organizations that are on the ground to do that. And, quite often these organizations are stepping in when it's really needed and where we need these locally tailored solutions. So by not funding them properly, a lot of their energy and resources are going towards trying to chase the funding and to solve this problem. So I think that if we fund them better in the first place and we take away that stress and uncertainty, then we'll be able to really amplify the impact that they're having. The second one, which we've just announced today and we're really excited about, I think it actually overlaps with what was said about having a legislated right to a healthy environment. And we've announced that we want to basically see the creation of a Future Generations Act. That's been done elsewhere, and you might think on the surface, that doesn't sound kind of right up the alley of conservation, but it actually is, because it's about establishing a commissioner who is responsible for holding politicians and public institutions accountable. So it's basically about making sure that any decision that we make today is really taking into account future generations. And we think that things like, halting species extinction, protecting native habitats, for example, we heard about the gang cockatoo, such an emblematic species in the ACT, now listed as endangered. We think it's really important to have a commissioner who actually has the power to step in and, for example, to halt runaway native habitat clearing. So that's another commitment that we have. The third one, actually, this overlaps. I think a little bit has been said about this is the increasing, what we need in terms of increasing ranger numbers. So we keep on hearing from people across the ACT that we need more rangers. I think we're crying out for that. The numbers that we have at the moment are simply not enough. If we even added just one ranger to each team, it could make a really significant difference. And speaking of, especially when it comes to managing invasive species, and speaking of invasive species, I think that, we can't ignore findings from a recent New South Wales report on the poor management of invasive species. And something else that we're concerned about, I guess, is following the precedent of other jurisdictions, such as New South Wales in this case, when that jurisdiction might be lagging behind anyway, and it might not be the solution that we need here in the ACT. So we think addressing ranger numbers, workforce numbers, better coordination, and making sure that solutions are sort of more tailored to our concept, to our context. Another one which builds on what we heard in the election platform actually is conserving the Western Edge. We know that that's under threat from development, and we share the concern about that. We think the area would make a much better national park than basically being flattened to build new car-dependent suburbs. And we know that developments like that can lead to the complete fragmentation of habitats, which is one of the leading causes of biodiversity loss. So we think that's really concerning. But also there's a hypocrisy, calling ACT the bush capital while going full steam ahead with unsustainable urban sprawl, which is only damaging for us. So while developments like Ginninderry, for example, might claim to have really ambitious sustainability goals, 60% tree coverage, for example, we need to question whether that's really achievable because residents would still be largely car dependent. So we also think we need to think about the mismatch between announcements and how it would look on the ground in terms of how it plays out. The last one I'll mention is active travel infrastructure, and that was also mentioned in the election platform. And we're really committed to building a genuine investment in this because we think we need to be treating walking and cycling as really essential parts of our energy transition and not just as afterthoughts. So, why is it that we don't invest in bike paths and pedestrian-friendly infrastructure with the same seriousness and enthusiasm that we invest in roads? So we think that all current and future light rail routes, for example, should also be supported by really sophisticated active travel infrastructure, which is not just about reducing emissions, but it's also about creating a really livable and also a really healthy city that we can all be proud of. So they're sort of the kind of specific commitments, but on a broader level, I just think that we also need to talk about, the impact, the kind of opportunity cost of when we see ineffective and or inefficient policies and or badly implemented policies. It can kind of crowd out the resources and, what we can put into genuinely solving conservation issues. And we're sort of concerned. We think that there have been some really bad policies that have been followed. And I think I would need far more than 10 minutes to go through the inventory of what they might be. But, if we can apply an evidence-based lens, which is what we're really big on with the Independence for Canberra, then we do think that it's going to help with being able to address issues in this sphere. And we're quite concerned about the crowding out, even seeing most recently announcements which are kind of not really helping with it, which seem to be kind of headline grabbing things like bringing the Birdman event back to Canberra. I mean, that might be really fun, but it's not going to address climate change. And if we're not taking the action that we need in this space, I think we need to be talking about the prioritization of ideas as well. So on a broader level, we would try to apply an evidence-based lens to everything that we're doing. And that's why we're pleased to say that a lot of what we're doing is very much aligned to the election platform as well. Finally, I think, and I'll touch on this when we get to Q&A, you know, a lot of my answers will talk about that we need to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. I think quite often when we try to take really bold action in one policy area, it might be that we increase inequities in another, or we put lower and middle income households in, you know, situations that are unattainable with the incentives and things that we give. So yeah, we think that while we're taking greater action in this space, we also need to be thinking about equity and making sure that we are making sure that it's inclusive, all of these changes for everybody in Canberra. I reckon I might have taken up roughly about 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. But just to say thank you so much for including us in this event. I'm really excited for the questions as well. They're really fantastic questions that have come through. And if we run out of time based on those questions and you have further questions, then like I said, feel free to get in touch and continue the dialogue beyond tonight. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. So our final candidate for the evening to do the introductory spiel is Rebecca Vassarotti. Rebecca, I'll ask you to unmute now and give you your 10 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm putting a timer on because I might take close to 10 minutes. And although we're meeting virtually, I did want to also acknowledge that we are meeting on the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, recognising other families that do have connection to this beautiful place that we get to call home. I also wanted to really recognise the impacts of dispossession, colonisation and structural disadvantage that have created so many challenges for our traditional owners. You know, we continue to work through the really challenging issues of traditional ownership and know that building new foundations will heal us all. I know that this is going to take time and we'll make missteps, and we've got many miles to walk to get us to a better place in relation to truth-telling, self-determination and justice. And in just having this discussion, I think it is important that we really recognise the extraordinary wisdom of our First Nations people who have for millennia cared for country. And we're only really just starting to understand and build our land management and cultural practices to really recognise this knowledge. It is really fantastic to be here today to talk about this really important issues. And I did want to take just a couple of minutes to reflect on the strong foundations in which we start this conversation and really reflect on where we've been and where we've got to over the last 4 years. It has been an extraordinary privilege to be the Minister for Environment and Heritage, and more recently, the Minister for Parks and Land Management. It's been a period where we have had our fair share of challenges, responding to the aftermath of the Black Summer in our parks and reserves, responding to a global pandemic, dealing with floods and 3 years of La Niña, watching the significant changes to our climate that are happening right now. And despite this, or maybe because of this, I do think we have some things to be really proud of. Key among this is the strong relationship we've forged with our different volunteers and land managers. I'm really pleased that we have been able to provide stability for some of our key volunteer organisations, particularly our catchment groups. We've established the Biodiversity Conservation Forum as a place for joint problem solving and environmental action. And we've continued to support strong community environment protection through enhanced environmental grants programs. We have tackled the big issues, particularly around invasive species and weed management. Decisions that we've made in our urban areas, including moving towards jurisdictional wide cat containment, will have a profound impact on protecting our natural environment. We are on the leading edge of managing invasive species, particularly in our national parks. And we've worked to repair damage in Namadgi, fought to save threatened species from extinction, and moved to the important work of restoration. I'm really proud of our Connecting Nature, Connecting People project that has worked to embed our environmental values into our planning system and start to protect our precious remnant patches into a restored landscape. But we have got so much work to do. If we are truly to be the bush capital, we need to increase our care and stewardship in our beautiful country. We need to protect it from the threats it faces so it can in turn protect us. We need to restore and build resilience in our forests, our grasslands, our waterways, so they can act as a sanctuary for ourselves and wildlife. To ensure that we do have appropriate resourcing, we have committed to establishing a $50 million bush capital restoration fund, funded through the water abstraction charge, to ensure that we have dedicated funds to support the work of looking after catchments, building land bridges, landscape-based restoration work, including looking at our lost species, and expanding our work around invasive species and threatened species. We absolutely need to restore our relationship and our partnership with traditional owners. There is a pressing and urgent need to build First Nations capacity to recognise their leadership and support joint environmental management of our reserves and waterways. However, foundational work needs to happen, particularly around the issues of who speaks for country, for us to achieve our vision for self-determination and joint management. And this isn't something we can impose as governments, and the road requires us to be really comfortable with that, with being uncomfortable, because we need to acknowledge real harms, difficult truths, and create the space and times for these challenging conversations. But it's a piece of work that the ACT Greens is absolutely up for. We know that we need stronger laws to protect our environment. Greens in government have led the nation by enshrining a right to a healthy environment into law and to improve protection in Canberra's important ecosystems and waterways during land development and construction, and increasing the funding around nature protection enforcement. But we do need to do more. We need to put environmental decision-making in the hands of environmental decision makers, not the planners. We need to establish an independent and a well-funded environmental protection authority. And we need to ensure that our nature laws are enforced. We also need to continue to push the federal government to reform our national laws and stop kicking the can down the road. We are really fortunate that we've got 60% of our landmass protected through the reserve estate, but we know that there are still lots of patches of land with high conservation values, and they are not currently in our reserve system and are at risk. I would really like to acknowledge the really important work of the Conservation Council in partnership with others in developing up the biodiversity network. It's been really useful, and work also already started on how to utilise this. And a piece of related and unfinished business is looking at how we reform environmental offsets approaches and ensure that all known conservation habitat on unleased and public land is placed in our reserve system or does have adequate protection through other mechanisms such as conservation zoning classification. We need to protect the bush we have left, and it is time that we commit to an urban boundary and stop sprawling into precious bushland. We can't continue to see precious patches effectively being land banked and degraded rather than being put into the reserve system if that's what's required. And while we have had a recent win with parts of Blue Block, there is much more to be done. All of this work needs to be done in partnership. There's no way that the government can do this alone, and nor should we. Nurturing the bush capital is partnership work, and we must continue to support our community partners, our environmental volunteers and our stewards. This does require additional funding support, as well as a willingness from government to share control and management of our bush capital. And we have recently announced $20 million of additional funding for conservation and environmental groups to ensure that they do have long-term sustainability and security. Obviously, the issue of climate change is key to us, and we are really proud of the work that we've done. In future work, just transition is at its heart, particularly supporting low-income households to transition away from fossil fuel gas, to support renters and people in complex buildings like apartments. The issue of active travel and how we support public transport is also key. This election, like all elections, is going to be vitally important for people, as well as this part of our beautiful planet. Environmental stewardship is a core element of the ACT Greens election plan, and we certainly hope that we are able to continue our strong partnership to care for our bush capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all 4 candidates for the great introductory remarks. It's really good to hear some of the issues that have already been covered and things that are kind of already aligned with our platform is very nice to hear. So what we're going to do now, we're already running on over to early, so we're already running early, which is really positive, which means we've got plenty of time for questions. Now I have a long list of questions, and hopefully what we'll do is I'll ask these questions. We can cover off what people might already be thinking, and then we can see if there's any more at the end, because we do have plenty of time for this session, but we'll see how we go. So I've got them in order, and just so folks know, the candidates have all been sent these questions, so hopefully that gives us some space to have thought about them beforehand and have a think about it. But what I've done is we've had lots of questions that have been sent in that have been similar. So that if you've written a question and it's been very specific, I might have condensed it or put into other question, but they'll all be based on very similar themes. So for all of you, what I might do is so what it's doing is it's making me ask you to unmute every time. So what I might just do is unmute all 4 of you and then just stay unmuted for this section, for the rest of the section, because I don't think this will be too much. So I'll do that, and I'm sure we can all be civil and not jumping on each other. And I don't think we're going to have a Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, chatting over each other kind of situation in this room. So let's start off. I think this one has already been covered by all of your statements, but let's start off with about the provision of funding to Canberra's environmental NGOs. Obviously, the Conservation Council is one of those NGOs, but there's also Sea Change, the Canberra Environment Centre, land catchment groups, all of these groups. And one of the things that we've all been saying for quite a while is that we're integral to this process, integral to ensuring that our environment is protected, but also continuously starved of funding, which means that instead of doing that work, we often spend all of our time working on getting funding. So I wanted to ask, do you support provision of extra funding? And maybe you've all sort of mentioned this actually, which is really positive, but do you want to go into some any more detail? Maybe let's go in reverse order this time, Rebecca. I'll ask you to.
Yeah, I'm really happy to jump in. Yes, we will. Like in terms of this this round, we've certainly looked at providing that support to catchment groups, but I think particularly the peaks, Conservation Council, Environment Centre, Canberra Environment Centre, Sea Change, I think have made a very compelling case. We think it's actually time to really look at how we do a commissioning process, so we really support these organisations, particularly around the critical advice that they provide to government. When we also would like to have a look at how we sort of provide multi-year grants for some of our particular organisations who's doing that longer term restoration work. So, as I noted, we've put out a fairly significant initiative around that includes uplifting the funding and commissioning outcomes for key environmental groups and those that support environmental volunteers of $12 million, as well as looking at $1.5 million to expand the environmental grants program and provide multi-year grants when that's appropriate.
Vanessa?
Yeah, just to build on that, I think we're aligned with the Greens and I think everybody in this forum, it seems, in that NGOs are obviously the backbone of our critical conservation and environmental efforts. So I think it's a no-brainer, to be honest. I think it's actually a question of how much funding, and is the amount that's just been mentioned, is that enough, or should we go even more? And I think that there's so much to be done in this space that yes, and I think the more funding, the better. And I think to go a bit further, I think it's not just about funding in general, it's about really smart kind of targeted investment and making sure that funding is then aligned to hopefully evidence-based decisions, to good kind of measurement and tracking, to helping NGOs to really scale their impact. We think that there's a lot of proven solutions and things that are being done in this space, but just not the resources to really scale things up. So helping to amplify those efforts. And we also think it's about sort of fostering a collaborative relationship where NGOs actually genuinely have a voice at the table and kind of, in any kind of co-design and collaborative process, making sure that the NGOs that are on the grassroots of this doing such incredible work, that we're not just giving them funding, but no kind of autonomy in being able to shape the future direction of everything that we do in this field. So we think, yes, absolutely to funding. 2, do we need to think about even more funding? And 3, it's not just funding, it's all of these other things as well that need to go hand in hand with it.
Suzanne?
Thanks, Simon. Yes, as I said in my opening remarks, we are open to providing more funding. My understanding is, and I think Rebecca's also touched on this as well, is that there is a process and a discussion already underway between EPSDD, the ACT government, and the peaks, and we'd be committed to seeing that through and looking at what we can do to improve those funding arrangements so that the groups can get on with what they do best.
Great, thank you. And finally, Leanne?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I said the same. We all understand the amount of hours you all put in and the lack of funding that you do get, and without you, there's no way we could afford the work that you do. So it's important to make sure that that funding is correct. And I think, you know, Rebecca and Suzanne and I were at the Rural Landholders Forum on Monday night, and we need your expertise. You know, I said to them, I'm not a farmer, I don't know how to really make this work, and so we're keen to hear from you, and that's what you all are amazing at, and I would expect that you would be informing government on the important things that we need to do.
Great, thank you. Look, I think that we're all delighted to hear that that we've got kind of unanimity across the 4 candidates here. I think that will probably, we might start entering into spaces where we don't have unanimity, which is also fine, but it's nice to have that to start at that place. The next question I've got, which is I think one that was added in late, but I think is important, but I think it's already been touched on by a couple of people, has been, we obviously have the review of the Nature Conservation Act coming up, a statutory review. This is our core environment legislation. I just wanted to get a little bit more information on what folks' views of this legislation are, and anything that you might want to see changed when that review happens. And I'm sorry, this is one question that came a bit late that I didn't get to you also. If I understand, if you need to come back, we are also happy to take answers, and we can post them later on.
Do you want me to start?
Well, yeah, or Leanne, did you?
I'll need to come back to you on this one. I'll be honest, I haven't spent a lot of time in that area.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah, sure. Look, I actually think the review of the Nature Conservation Act is really significant. I think this is really important, and a really important opportunity. I think that I touched on in my presentation that it's become really clear that environmental decision making is not held in the hands of environmental decision makers. It's actually held in the planner's hands. So I think that is it's a fundamental issue that we need to look at in terms of the Nature Conservation Act, actually making it an act that has real power, and actually really looks to, you know, ensuring that things such as the declaration of reserves is something that's held with the Environment Minister, not with an independent planning authority that has a whole lot of competing interests. So I think that is a key thing. I think we also need to look at how we, you know, bolster the enforcement of the act, and ensure that we have good, you know, good strong laws, and then we enforce them.
Suzanne, I know you touched on this very briefly in your...
Yeah. So look, we are committed, Labor is committed to seeing this statutory review done and done properly, because there's statutory reviews, and we'd actually like this to be a pretty good one that considers a lot of issues. I'd also, just for full disclosure, like to let everyone know I am an urban planner by profession. So Rebecca, even though you're picking on my profession a little bit tonight and I don't agree with everything you're saying, I won't take it personally. But
it wasn't meant personally.
Look, I must say, a little bit as a planner and as a Labor person, I'm not sure I quite agree with this idea that planners are making all the environmental decisions. Certainly, I think this will be a robust we go forward between my Greens colleagues and Labor, and perhaps some of the other people who are in the Assembly with us, but certainly looking at how we can best position the Nature Conservation Act to be modern, to be fit for purpose, and to be meeting the objectives that we want that Act to meet. We're very open to looking at that.
Vanessa, did you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, sort of overlapping. Like, I think, you know, in general, we're very excited about this. We think it is absolutely needed, and we think, you know, this is an example for a policy area where we need change on such a level that really good, bold legislative changes are absolutely needed. I think I would sort of just flag some high level things, such as I think implementation is going to be key, and Rebecca touched on that. I think, you know, enforcement for any of these reviews and processes is really the key thing, and that's where we need good accountability. But then I also think, you know, one of our key principles is working in a collaborative way, and I think that it's going to be really important to make sure that the voices of those who are on the ground working in these areas can actually feed through into what changes are needed. And, you know, the Conservation Council is doing so much to feed into this. So I think that implementation is going to be key, and making sure that it genuinely reflects the voices of those that are doing so much in this field will be key. But like in principle, in general, we think absolutely it's needed, and we're so happy that's happening, and it aligns with everything we're trying to do, which is just raising the bar in terms of accountability, and this will be crucial for that.
Great, thank you all. So the next question, we actually had kind of 4 questions that came in about this topic, which is around the budget and funding. So we had a couple of different variations of this, such as, given the ACT has declared a climate emergency, how are you ensuring that climate and nature are prioritised and properly funded? Or do you believe that we should see an increase in funding? The most in-depth question, which is the one I'll ask you officially, is, you know, in 2024 to 2025, only 3% of the budget is allocated to environment, sustainable development and climate change. And only a proportion of this is available to look after the remaining natural areas in the ACT, including threatened species and remnants of critically endangered ecological processes. In addition to being important in its own right in protecting other species, the natural environment provides a crucial role in improving climate resilience, facilitating human health and well-being, and improving natural functionality of the environment, for example, for improving water quality and supporting pollinating insects. Do you commit to providing more and consistent funds to retain the natural systems and manage them for values that they provide to humankind? So this is really about increasing funding for the management of our environment. So I think with that 3% fund is a question about that 3% figure is about the amount of money that goes into environment sustainability, that directorate. It's not our entire budget. But yeah, that's a question about funding the management and of our natural environment. And maybe I'm just going to start going randomly now, I think. Maybe Vanessa, if you want to start off with this one.
Yeah, so I think yeah, absolutely we do. You know, we touched on it before. I think in so many of these answers, actually, it's highlighting the importance of long-term, more funding, but also long-term. And I mean, around this time, election time, we see so many short-term gestures, and that's just not going to cut it in this space. And words alone also won't cut it. So the previous question was going to be about declaring a climate emergency, and you know, I think that is a first step, but just declaring that, like, we've already seen so many concerning statistics, damning reports, you know, framing something as an emergency without putting in the extra funding and commitment, I think only takes us so far. So yeah, basically we think that it's woefully inadequate, the funding, and I think everybody in this forum hopefully would agree, hopefully even the other candidates do as well. And, you know, this is a policy area for which, you know, none of this is just like a nice to have thing, a thing that we can hopefully fit into the budget. Like, there are really damaging long-term costs that come from not addressing this. Human cost, obviously, cost to the environment, cost on so many fronts for future generations as well, to go back to what I was saying. So we just think that we can't afford to flip it around. We can't afford not to adequately fund things. And that's especially when it comes to protecting threatened species, critically endangered ecosystems. We need the visionary ideas, and we need the funding to back that up as well. So yeah, as an independent, I'm committed to this. All of the independents are really committed to this, because we like to go beyond just kind of thinking about what the idea is on paper, but also thinking about implementation. And implementation falls away in so many, you know, in this area if we can't fund it properly. So yeah, more funding, long-term funding, consistent funding, and going far beyond these short-term kind of headline grabbing gestures that often come up at election time, but really tackling this head on, we're committed to.
Suzanne, I'll drop to you next.
Thanks, Simon. Look, I think the first thing I want to say is I'm always a little bit hesitant when we start saying things like it's 3% of the whole budget and we need more funding in this part. And that's not to say that we don't need more funding. I think it's more just to acknowledge that sometimes we can make improvements, and quite often we can make improvements that don't necessarily need to have a huge funding line attached to them. And part of the is one example I'm thinking of there is the Living Infrastructure Territory Plan, which was intended to make sure that we have more living infrastructure, more ground cover, more sustainable buildings. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a large budget line within the budget, but it's going to have a huge impact on the outcomes we have within our environment and with our nature. So certainly, I think I appreciate what the question is doing. Is it saying, hey, it looks like it's this small amount when you look at it in the comparison to everything else. But the question I ask myself when I'm always doing it is not how much money should I spend, but hey, what do we need to do and how do we best get there? So that'll be what we continue to do as Labor, noting that budgeting is a series of prioritisations. I'll always be arguing for more money, just as I'm sure the Health Minister will always be arguing for more money. The Education Minister will always be arguing for more money. But I think importantly asking that question of, what can we do and what's the best way to get there in what we're trying to achieve? I think I'm just going to, if you'll allow me to indulge me, Simon, I think the Greens have put out this $50 million fund. And certainly while I think the intent of it is very agreeable, I do question again how we fund that because the water extraction charge is one that already goes into revenue. It is expended. So I think we do need to have a little bit more conversation around how we're going to get to what we're promising to do as parties. For me, again, it's very much looking at how do we get the outcomes we want, not who has the best policies. We need to make sure we can deliver them, that they're practical as well. So I'll just leave it there, being a little bit cheeky, preempting what I think Rebecca's about to say, but I'm sure, given I sort of had a go at her over being a planner, I'm sure she'll have a bit of a go at me over this one and we'll all have a good laugh afterwards. So thanks.
Well, look, given that, maybe Rebecca, I'll go to you next on this question.
For sure. Look, I think it is a really fair reflection that people are making in terms of the level of funding that's provided into this area. It is something that, I can certainly hand on heart tell every person in this room that we've fought hard to get significant environmental funding in each budget. And we have seen some, significant investments over this term, particularly the Nature Connecting People initiative and the Conserving Canberra initiative, where we, for the first time in decades, we're actually seeing restoration works. But this is the whole reason that we've talked about this $50 million fund, because we don't think it's adequate, and it has had this real issue around long-term funding, exactly what Vanessa is saying. So that's why we have identified the establishment of this fund, that we can actually really prioritise environmental work, and particularly restoration work, and particularly that longer term work. So it's not an issue of having to go in every budget and fight and, hand over my 3 lungs and 2 kidneys. That has been, what's happened every ERC this term. In terms of Suzanne's comment in terms of how we fund it, I think, again, it's a fair comment. I think we do need to ensure that we have got a really good and a transparent understanding of how that happens. In terms of the water abstraction charge, that is something that is charged to everyone. It goes into consolidated revenue, and then again, whether it be in environment or in waterways, we have to argue in terms of the priorities, in terms of getting funding to support those activities. The accounting in terms of the water abstraction fund, it doesn't add up in terms of what is taken, and then what is actually funded. And so, we've actually done quite a lot of analysis in this work. So it is something that, when we're talking about the work around this, it's around healthy catchment management, work around our waterways, but also, landscape level restoration.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Leanne.
Yeah, look, I think it's as we've all said, there needs to be more funding for community groups and things like that, but that ongoing education with the community to keep us all involved. I don't know that I will say our environment policy isn't coming out. I haven't done the numbers to work out where we stand on how much it is that we're willing to commit. But what I will say is that if, encouraging Canberrans to get off gas and go to electric, to get out of their fuel vehicles and into electric vehicles, solar on their roof, all of these things are taking the community on the journey with us. And I think that's important. And it's not, as Suzanne said, we have to take a bit of a practical approach about this and do everything we can to make sure the community knows where we're going and make sure we inform them and invest in the best ways that we can to make sure that happens.
Right. Thank you, Leanne. And I saw that you had a dog a minute ago on your lap. I was thinking that in the world of Zoom meetings, putting dogs on your lap is probably a very effective way of getting votes. It was very adorable.
She does come with me to almost every mobile office, but you know, we do whatever we can as Liberals, you know.
I'll encourage if any other candidates have dogs, and they're more than welcome to hop on your lap.
She's unusually chatty tonight. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's fine. Sorry, little segue there, or not segue, but little distraction there. Let's move on to the next question. The next question we've got is about Indigenous land management, which I think a couple of candidates have touched on already. The question says, considering 80% of the world's biodiversity is under Indigenous stewardship, how would you be advocating for the return of land to Indigenous people? I think the person who I haven't asked to go first yet is Suzanne. So maybe Suzanne, I'll ask you to go first on this one.
Thanks, Simon. I'm happy to go whenever you ask me to go for future reference.
Yeah, that's fine. Just trying to be fair as possible.
That's right. Look, it's a really good question, and ACT Labor, we remain committed to working with the custodians of lands, First Nations peoples, the elected body, to be guided by that. So while I don't have a specific answer for you as to the actions that would be taken, it's not because we don't have an answer, it's because we want to respect that self-determination. And we'll continue to work with the groups that are there to make sure that we are returning country and taking on board the views of our local custodians to make sure that the work we do incorporates those.
Right. Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy. Yeah, absolutely. We that has to be a current conversation, a constant and current conversation with all of the elders across the ACT, and in working with them and finding out what's best for Canberra.
Rebecca or Vanessa?
I'm happy to go. Look, I think I touched on this a little bit in my opening remarks. We are absolutely committed to joint management and looking at how, you know, we create self-determination. We are at a really challenging place, particularly in terms of traditional custodians and really identifying who speaks for country, and we really need to work with community around that. It isn't something that can be imposed by government, but we do think there's some really practical things that we can do. We did sort of move to Ngunnawal, establishing Ngunnawal Ranger positions in this current term, and we think that we need to double the number of those. We are currently, we do have the Dharawal Ngunnawal Caring for Country Committee, which is a committee that does operate within government. And we've actually started a review on that in terms of how it can be more effective and really elevate its status. There's a really interesting conversation to have in terms of the role of the elected body and also the role of traditional custodians, because there are slightly different things. And so I think that, again, having those conversations with community is really important. In terms of other practical things that we think, you know, we have actually started to do some cultural burns. And so I think really doing a lot more work in that area. And we'd also and one of the things that we're really keen to do is establish a pilot project to really look at how we can work with First Nations-led businesses to share traditional knowledge, you know, support ecotourism and cultural environmental opportunities. There's some great First Nations businesses operating at the moment, and we'd love to work out how we can provide more support to them. So I just wanted to also just touch in terms of, we've been looking at this in terms of heritage as well. And again, you know, we really want to hand back the decision making around cultural heritage to our traditional custodians. But again, we have to do that foundational work of who speaks for country and the mechanisms which will do it. But that's a really exciting piece of work that the Greens are very, very passionate about progressing.
And Vanessa, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just to, I mean, there'll be a lot of overlap here, I think, just to say that, yeah, we think that it should be at the heart of our environmental policies and approach. I mean, traditional custodians have managed and protected lands for thousands of years using methods that are far more sustainable and effective than modern methods. So yeah, we think, again, this is a sort of a no-brainer kind of a question, really. But I think it comes down to, as has been touched on, like doing it in a collaborative way, really ensuring that we're not imposing things, but we're we're doing the foundational work and yeah, doing it in the best way possible. And I think that, you know, this is an area for which we can do more harm than good if we don't do it in the right way, and if it's just tokenistic sort of gestures. So we think not just transfers, but like long-term action in this space, which really harness the voice of traditional owners. And just to say as well that we think that, you know, we voted yes in the referendum. We think that we have a chance to really be at the forefront and kind of lead the way in this area. But again, it needs to be in a very collaborative way and kind of harnessing the voices of the traditional owners. Yeah.
Right, so thank you all. Our next question is on urban sprawl and densification. So we had two questions on this, and I think they're both very similar. So the first one is, how can we stop urban sprawl, which threatens the very character of the bush capital, and intelligently densify Canberra's populations and services? And similarly, what are your thoughts on increasing density of housing rather than more new suburbs? And do you support a city limit beyond which the city cannot expand? Maybe I'll go back to you, Vanessa, on this one.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so to start, so I'm going to start with the urban sprawl question. And yeah, just to say, we think that is a real threat to our identity as the bush capital. And if we stand by and allow it to continue, then we're going to lose so much of what makes our city unique, and what I think that everyone in this forum would really love about Canberra. So yeah, we think that we need to kind of rethink our approach to growth and really focus on kind of I guess evidence-based densification approaches which respect Canberra's character, but also obviously take into account the needs of our growing population. So there's a lot of evidence in this space of what can work well. So I think that we can draw on that from elsewhere, but trying to kind of plan around key hubs using existing infrastructure to avoid unnecessary expansion into greenfield areas. But also as we do this, we need to make sure that we're protecting our natural environment, putting safeguards in place. And yeah, I think my sort of thing to say would be that densification, you know, it doesn't have to just mean more concrete. We can have certain stereotypes that go with it, but it can actually mean more green rooftops, urban parks, nature reserves integrated into cities. So I think it's actually, if we can kind of revamp the notion of that, I think, and think about how exciting it can be if we do it really well, but also making sure that as we grow, we improve service delivery. So yeah, making sure that we're investing in things, renewable energy, sustainable transport infrastructure. Yeah, making sure that we're kind of trying to preserve the best of Canberra, but also making sure that we're well prepared for the future. Which brings me to the second question was about should we be increasing density or expanding suburbs, and should we have limits? So basically, I would say that, yeah, I do support increasing housing density in existing urban areas rather than continuing to expand elsewhere, which can damage natural habitats. I think that expanding not only threatens our natural environment, but it also places a greater burden on things like infrastructure. And I think, you know, I'm in Brindabella. We have suburbs as they are that are completely disconnected and don't have the most basic services. So the thought of kind of having that neglect there and then trying to expand further and placing extra strain, I think is, you know, I'd question whether it's even feasible really. So I think that we need to embrace really smart, sustainable growth strategies. And as for a city limit, I do support the idea of setting a boundary. I think it would, you know, quite literally draw a line in the sand in terms of thinking about how we can best ensure that we're maintaining our green spaces and protecting biodiversity. But yeah, I think basically in addition to, we need to I think that setting city limits is a good idea, but hand in hand with that, everything I've just said about ensuring that the process of kind of densifying is accompanied by really thoughtful urban design. And I'm not the urban designer in the room, so Susan might have ideas about that, but I think that there are some really exciting things that we can do in that space. So yeah, drawing on the evidence and examples from elsewhere, hopefully.
Maybe with that mentions, maybe that's an opportunity to go to Suzanne as the urban planner on this one.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. So I think if I can go back to the first part of the question, which I think was on urban sprawl. So like got the policy to continue to have a split between infill and greenfields, and it's a 70-30 split. Now we've had a bit of a chat about moving that to a higher number of infill and a lower number of greenfields. I think that will continue to be a healthy and warranted conversation. But for the time being, Labor's position remains. We do need a mix of both, with an emphasis on the infill. With that in mind, we'll continue to support efforts to make sure that we are densifying, particularly around our local shopping centres, the places where it makes sense to have more activity, to have more people living, and also really supporting that missing middle, which I know quite a few people in this chat have probably been part of the active conversation that's gone around that. So making sure that those, our townhouse style accommodation is actually meeting the needs of what we need for our population, and is appealing, and that people want to move into it. So I think that probably, without me putting on my planner's hat and sitting here for the rest of the time limit, I'll probably start to wrap it up there. I think, look, as to the urban boundary, I think this is a little bit of it's an easy concept to say. It's a lot more complicated in its application of what it actually means. And ACT Labor is definitely of the view that this needs a lot more discussion so that there's not unintended consequences. So I understand, and there's been plenty of precedent around the world to varying levels of success in achieving the outcomes it's seeking, as to whether an urban growth boundary is the right thing to go ahead. And does it, if it's a hard line, sometimes it just sends people panicking, and we end up with a lot of unintended consequences around what does happen, speculation within the market as to costs and so forth, and whether we can actually achieve the outcomes we want through other mechanisms that don't necessarily have the same label. So I think this will continue to be an active conversation. It's one Labor will participate in, but we're certainly not quite at the point where we're ready to say, yes, we would do that. There's far more to consider there. I think in looking at how we continue to grow as a city and how this fits with nature, and I think we've sort of touched on a little bit, and this goes back to the commitment to have the landscape plan. We are the bush capital, but we're also quite deliberately a city in a landscape. That was part of Burley Griffin's original intent and design, was to make sure that we had all those natural areas. And while he was coming out of very much from an industrial mindset of big polluting industry, and we don't quite have that here in Canberra, it's certainly one that I think we want to hold on to, reimagine. And I think there's a really important question there for us to ask of, as we go forward into our next century, how do we continue to remain the city in a landscape, and what does that look like, given the challenges we face today that Burley Griffin might have guessed at but could never entirely anticipate. I think it's pretty fair to say a computer might not have been top of his might not have been top of his imaginative part. Transportation was completely different, and we know we've got a bit of a transportation task there too. Climate change didn't exist. I mean, it was probably happening when Burley Griffin was there, but didn't exist as a concept. So we've got all these challenges that we now face that we need to start to reconcile, put together, spatialise, and get much better on the how we're going to respond to them. And that's what I really see the benefit of this landscape plan being, is bringing together the different parts of the built environment, not demonising the planners, but letting the landscape architects get in there and have a bit more of a say, because it's the missing component from our current response, so that we do end up with healthier urban areas that are more fit for purpose, that are for people, that are healthy, have green spaces, and it's happening deliberately and not by accident. And that's the point we want to get back to. So I think, Simon, again, at the risk of potentially taking up the rest of the forum's time, because I could talk about this topic, I think, till the cows come home, I'll probably just leave it there. And if you've got any more questions, I'm happy to chat them through.
It's good to have something that you're very passionate about, and I think urban planning is a good one to be passionate about when you're a local MLA, given a lot of our discussions in the ACT are about urban planning.
Yeah, no, it's great on the doors when you tell people you're a politician and an urban planner by profession. You know you're in for a long chat.
I'm not surprised. Leanne, maybe I'll jump to you on this one.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I've almost forgotten the first couple of questions, but the idea
about urban sprawl and setting city limits.
I spoke to a town planner once, not Suzanne, and they said that Canberra can grow and not look much different than what it does now if people are given the opportunity to change their blocks, diversify a little, and make things look a little bit different. Not everybody wants a quarter-acre block, and not everybody wants to live in an apartment. And we can still maintain the way Canberra looks by a few little adjustments, so that people who do have that quarter-acre block that might want to downsize and add a granny flat or whatever it is. You know, my point is that I agree it doesn't all have to be, you know, paved paradise and put up a parking lot type of situation. We can have all sorts of good alternatives, but I think that's the key also, is that there are alternatives for people, that they do have genuine choice when it comes to the housing that they're after. And with that, the Canberra Liberals are crystal clear that it doesn't mean houses till the end of time, because we are committed to keeping the bush capital. I grew up here, I love it, and that's what we want for our town, to remain that bush capital with the urban spaces, with the green areas that we can get out to and take our kids. It's so important. But at the same time, we do need genuine choice for families.
Thanks. And Rebecca, finally.
Thank you. Look, in terms of the urban boundary, I don't think it's that complicated. The Greens absolutely believe we have come to the time where we need to set an urban boundary. I think it's appropriate that we fill in the suburbs, you know, in the areas that we have, finish off Molonglo. But when I look out at the western edge and I, you know, see the environmental values that are out there in terms of, you know, nesting habitat for superb parrots, you know, the incredible diversity of Blue's flock and beyond, you know, the justification for sprawling out there is very, very limited. So we think it is time to set an urban boundary. We do absolutely support densification, but also about doing it well. I think we've been really frustrated that we've been sort of set up, you know, there's been a dichotomy set up about whether or not it's about environment or housing, and you can't have both. We think with good design and good planning, we actually can have both. In a densified city, our environmental infrastructure, that's, you know, the trees, the shrubs, our green spaces become more important, not less. And so we really need to look at, you know, how we say all of that stuff, you know, is as important as where we're going to put the roads, the footpaths and the buildings. So this does come down to good design. I have to say, I'm absolutely delighted to hear Suzanne talk about the fact that Labor will commit to a government landscape architect. This is something that we've actually been, you know, tussling with her colleagues in the executive for some time. So that's really fantastic. I think that's a really important thing that it looks like we've got some consensus on for the first time in a few years. Because one of the things that we also really believe is government needs to get involved. They actually need to intervene in some of these. We continue to look to the private sector to solve a problem that they've actually created. So when we look at densification, we think that there needs to be a government agency that's getting in there to look at how we, you know, do block consolidation, not just leave it up to the private market. So we can design really good spaces around, you know, more like the Kingstons that we, you know, that we've seen in the past, where we have good medium density and really great green space. You know, we've put on the table how we look at areas within our urban boundary, and I think the racecourse site is a really good example of that, in terms of let's look at land that is close to our city centre and actually ask the question is, what is appropriate and what is the best community outcome? Is it about giving a windfall profit to a private entity that's been propped up by the government for years with $8 million of taxpayers' money? Or can we actually look at creating, you know, not just some apartments around a race course, but a really well-planned suburb that really prioritizes green spaces, community facilities, schools, how we can renaturalize Sullivan's Creek. That's an example of the sorts of things that we believe government should be doing, and how we can actually get both. I just hope that what the travesty that happened with Stromlo Reach, where we actually saw decisions where we will see the destruction of habitat of threatened species be the last time we have to, you know, see that happen, and actually, you know, get called that we're, you know, stopping affordable housing because we've actually said it's not appropriate to be doing that, and we've got better opportunities within our urban boundary.
Thanks everyone on that. And I think Just because we've had this question has been asked a number of times, and I know that maybe some people might be asking the question of what a landscape architect actually is and does, which is something that I'm certainly thinking as well. Maybe, Suzanne, as you're the one who's raised this, can I ask you a little bit more about that, and then I can ask other candidates to respond to that, because I think it fits within the theme of this topic at this point in time.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Simon. And I'll try and do this in my not technical planner voice, like language. So within the built environment, there's a range of professions that all come together to make sure that what we construct is actually best suiting the needs we need. So you'll have the planners, they'll work at a level that's based on the city-wide. You'll have the architects, they're at a much smaller scale, so they're block specific in a lot of instances. And the planners and the architects sometimes fight a little bit the same way that Labor and the Greens sometimes fight. So that'll give you a good idea of their relationship. The landscape architects work at a scale that's probably more regional in basis, but very systems focused. And it is out of environmental traditions. They're not necessarily environmentalists. They will need to work with specialists within those areas. And we've already got quite a bit of work underway on the biodiversity mapping. So we've got that. What they can do, what landscape architects excel at and they're trained to do, is manage that interface between the human environment and the natural environment, so that the impacts of one aren't necessarily impeding on the other. They'll also create much better urban areas. So when we're talking about how do we get more parks, more green areas, better corridors for nature within our city, those are all the things that they will deliberately design. So I think hopefully that, and then you've got engineers as well. We can't forget our dear engineers who come with all the technical skills, and then all these great, designers and people with these creative thinking goes, oh, why do you have to tell me that, I'm 2 centimetres out on what will fit there. So what we're looking at doing is in bringing forward this plan is we know we have a lot of work going on across the other areas of the built environment. We don't have a recognised role for a government landscape architect. We're missing that piece of the puzzle. We don't have the bit that brings together all the connections, all the stuff that happens between buildings, and the bits that can start to bring together the networks across our city and link them with nature, so that, if we need to have a good connector between two preserved areas, we're making sure that we do actually allow for that, and we've got the space for the environment to flourish. So that's where it works, and done in conjunction with our environmental scientists who bring the expertise on the biodiversity and the conservation. Hopefully that wasn't too long and answers the question, Simon.
No, it certainly does. And I think just for the sake of fairness, does anybody else have anything to add around the landscape landscape architect?
Yeah, might just jump in. I think the other opportunity is really to connect that profession to the design review panel. And so bringing that profession into the design review panel, where major, major developments go to, get scrutiny from a design perspective, is one of the things that, we've really seen that there is a gap. This issue came up in the planning inquiry. It also was looked at in terms of the planning governance review. And that's why for some time the Greens have been saying that we did need a government landscape architect that would complement the roles of the government architect and other roles such as the government engineer. So I think it is a really positive thing. It also does sort of really link into the good work that has been done in terms of the new planning system, particularly around the design guides. We did a lot of work, particularly around the biodiversity sensitive design guide, which is one of the parts of the new planning system that hasn't got a lot of prominence, but actually will really set a standard in terms of how we ensure that biodiversity is really considered through our planning system.
Leanne or Vanessa, do you have anything to say on this particular issue? This is an extra question that's I've added in.
Look, not really, and this might be just the wrong thing to say, but I feel for a government that's very concerned about climate and what the landscape of Canberra looks like, if this is something that's been needed, then it's possibly time that they, hop on board and get it organised. I'm not saying that that's my position, but everyone's talking about this, so I don't understand sometimes in government why things like this, if it's identified as a need and something that is their desire to implement in Canberra, then something they probably should just get on board and do.
Well, Vanessa?
Yeah, I would just say I think it sounds really exciting, and it made me think of so I've worn many hats across different years, but most recently I was in academia. I'd done my PhD, And my research was focused on like, how and why do we keep on often following bad ideas, you know, and they keep on making it through. And one of the reasons is that, you know, often we don't have the right expertise crafting the solutions and what we're doing, and we follow these flashy ideas, things that aren't feasible, things that people with the expertise would say that just doesn't make sense, don't do that. And so I think this again is such a good idea for making sure that we've got the right people providing the right input at the right time. I think there's a timely point to do with this where you they need to be looped in kind of throughout the whole process. So I think it makes sense. And to be honest, I think that it complements a lot of the bigger picture things that we've all spoken about. So like really bold legislative changes. And I'd mentioned our commitment for the Future Generations Act and having a commissioner. And, you know, those are quite big picture things. And I think this is the kind of tangible on the ground change, which could complement those really well. So we're excited about it.
Right. I was just thinking in all of this conversation about densification, one of the reflections I have sitting in a townhouse at the moment and living in Yerrabee with close by to two of our candidates is we moved here from the inner north, and yes, we're in a denser area, but I actually have more nature reserves closer to me and much more nature closer to me than I did when I lived in a sort of single house closer to the city. And it's, you know, densification doesn't have to mean disconnection from nature. And I think it's really nice to hear everybody saying that in this conversation tonight. So that's really great. Let's do one more on some nature preservation, and then I think we'll turn to a little bit about climate change, because it's something that we haven't really discussed too much. But obviously, two of the big issues that have been floating around has been the protection of Blewett's Block and Lawson North, which Blewett's Block is near Molonglo, for those who don't know, and there has been an announcement recently of two of the three blocks there, a process to put those into a reserve. That's block, I always get the blocks mixed up, 402 and 12, and 403, or is it the other way around?
403.
403 and 12, and then 402 is currently on leased land, and there's some discussions about making that a reserve as well. And Lawson North is in Belconnen, and is an area of really important grasslands that we've been calling for to be put into reserves. That's currently federal land, but there is a clear indication that we moved into becoming territory land. So the simple question is, do you support the decision that was made about Blewett's Block to put it in, and will you commit to seeing that being put into reserve if you were put in a position of decision making? And if and when the land from Lawson North is put into territory land, would you support that becoming a reserve as well? Suzanne?
Okay, bear with me on this one because it's not my electorate, and I must say I haven't memorized all the different block numbers. But,
yeah, neither have I.
So even though I am a planner, I must admit I don't have every territory block memorized. Look, my understanding is that the current planning minister has moved towards looking at how we can incorporate Blewett's Block and more of those blocks into the nature reserve. So certainly we'll continue with that process and having the discussion about how best we do that. Lawson, I am more familiar with because I grew up in Girlang, so very familiar with that one, and had many conversations with the Cons Council. I know it's very important. I think even 2 CEOs ago, we were having this conversation about what to do with that block. It is currently Commonwealth land, so it's not within the ACT's custodianship as such yet. Certainly it will be a decision for future governments, but very cognizant and aware of the environmental factors within that. So if it was something that was to come into ACT hands, certainly would be very open to having the conversation about how to best look after its environmental properties.
Leanne?
It's a fail for me on this question. I'm sorry, everybody. I actually don't have in my mind our position on any of those, although I will say when I did have the environment portfolio, the Lawson, we did discuss that at length with many different groups. So I'm actually a bit surprised that it's still it's an ongoing, it's still going on, and things obviously do go far slower than I have expected. But I can get back to people if you're after our Liberals position with regard to Blewett's Block. It has been discussed, but I can't tonight in the back of my mind find that information for you.
Rebecca?
Yeah, look, certainly in relation to Blewett's Block, we're delighted that we are where we're at. It's got a little bit to go in terms of some community consultation, but we 100% support the protection of this as a reserve. The outstanding block is a block that is currently leased to the ANU. We understand it has significant environmental protections, and we would work to ensure that we get the rest of that into the reserve as soon as we can. In relation to Lawson North, we have been thinking a bit about this, and we think that there are a few things that we need to do. I think it was a really pertinent comment you made, Simon, in terms of the fact that we have seen very few reserves, and actually Blewett's Block will probably be the first one in many, probably in a couple of decades, the first reserve that is not attached to an offset. And so I think, we need to do some work, and I've certainly started this work in terms of creating clear criteria about when a nature reserve should be established that is actually decoupled from just because we're trying to destroy some habitat somewhere else. We do think that we need to create this ecological framework to allow conservation across all lease and zone types. We really need to push the Commonwealth Government on nature positive reforms, and that can include committing that Commonwealth land is protected to protect critical and ecological values, and it can be part of the 30 by 30 land conservation target that the Commonwealth has signed up to. And again, we really need to look at the issue of ending dodgy offsets and creating a regional plan that really reinforces important areas from development. So they're the kind of ways that we would go about it.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Vanessa.
Yeah, I think it's a nice segue because we shared a lot of the enthusiasm that Rebecca was just touching on. And I think actually the answer to this is going to sort of link into a lot of the other things that have been said throughout the night. So yeah, I'd fully support that. We know that it's home on Blewett's Block. We know that it's home to valuable ecosystems and threatened species. So, again, I think this fits into the basket of like, we simply can't afford not to do this. And I think it links back to what I was saying with the independence, where we're trying to take a lens of thinking about how the decisions made today affect future generations. And I think that designating Blewett's Block as a nature reserve is one of the many ways that we can take steps to safeguard it for future generations. So I would say, though, that I think that we need to go further, like just saying that it's declaring it as a reserve is not enough. And, it goes back to what we were saying about like adequately resourcing the implementation and the kind of enforcement of things. And that goes back to everything that we've said about making sure that the right resources are in place. Otherwise, we risk, maybe declaring it as a reserve, but not having the right resources to make sure that it isn't degraded over time. And it also links in, I think, to what we were saying about properly engaging with local communities and Indigenous custodians in the protection of it. So it's sort of an answer in which I kind of am making the links to everything else that's gone before tonight. And then in terms of the second question, which was about legally protecting Lawson North, again, like really supportive of that. I think that it's formal protection through legal mechanisms that can give it the best long-term protection. And I think the evidence is really clear on why that's so important. So I think the first step would be to advocate for its designation as a nature reserve, which would give it, like a high level of environmental protection. But again, the resources part and the actually making sure that things are sort of implemented and enforced. I think, we'd work to ensure that the land is sort of managed under a really robust framework, which takes into account all of the sorts of things that we've already spoken about. And again, like working really hard on the implementation of legally binding things, because we can make things legally binding, but again, it's all about the enforcement of that. So yeah, and that links to making sure that there's sufficient funding to the area's management, so that, as I've said in various answers, it can't just be a symbolic thing to take these strides forward in different ways, but to ignore the implementation. So yeah, my answer might sound a little bit like echoing previous things, but I think it's because it all kind of fits in together. But on an overarching point, I would just say that we're really enthusiastic about both of these things and think it's incredibly important.
Let's have a little bit of a change of pace, because I think we've talked a lot about nature protection at the moment. We haven't talked as much about the climate, and so we do have a few questions on the climate. I understand that some of the climate spokespeople aren't here, so I appreciate if some folks don't have full answers on all of these, but we'll do the best we can. So I think the first thing, the first simple question that we were asked, which I reckon for most of it might be a yes or no, or yes and explain or no and explain, is does each candidate support the Canberra's net zero 2045 net zero target? And let's just hand it over to see whether we get supports for our targets. Rebecca.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are really proud of the role that the Greens have played in terms of pushing for our targets. We are really proud of the work that we've done in terms of implementing our emissions reduction, and we will continue to push really hard on this.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely support it, but I would say that we support it as a minimum commitment and think that actually we could be even more ambitious. And, Independence for Canberra fits in as kind of a broader part of we're part of an independence movement for which we've seen a lot of independents playing a really key role in raising the bar in what we're striving for with environmental policy. And, I think that we need a really strong environmentally focused crossbench who can be there saying like, yes, we've done amazing things so far, but we need to be aiming even higher. So we think even, sooner than 2045, but at the same time, we need to be ensuring that we're not leaving people behind and that we're doing it in a really equitable way, which again goes back to the implementation point and really thinking through different groups. And yeah, as we talked about at the very start, the people who need this the most might be in situations where it's hard to make switches to certain changes that we're asking for. So we need to be thinking about that. But also just to say, the ACT in many ways we've kind of tried to lead the way in different ways, but targets alone aren't enough. So we can't just set a target like that, or as I said, an even more ambitious target without having really clear actionable policies that back it up, and also the enforcement of those policies, the right resources, making sure that sustainability is at the forefront. And this election forum and the work that the Conservation Council is doing, it's so important. So that has to keep on going, like I said, beyond this event. So yeah, we think it's a step in the right direction. We could aim higher, and we also think that we need to be continuously reassessing this because in this space as well, there are new technologies that we need to be thinking of. Things kind of change along the way, and so yeah, we think that there needs to be kind of reassessment and an iterative sort of approach that we're taking along the way.
I'll turn to you, Leanne.
Yeah, absolutely. The Canberra Liberals are committed to achieving net zero by 2045. But it's similar, having a target doesn't mean that the work stops. We have to be constantly looking at new ways that we can reduce the carbon footprint here in Canberra, investing in, sustainable, reliable, renewable energy that does keep the cost of energy low.
And Suzanne?
Yes, Labor is committed to the target. I would also just put out there, I think we've had a little bit of commentary from a number of people about how we get there. And realistically, we are headed into some of the harder parts of the decarbonisation of the economy. And certainly would ask some of the other panelists if I can, again, be a little bit cheeky and bold as to how we're going to get there when we don't see strong commitments for things like not having new suburbs attached to gas or not having that great commitment to get rid of vehicles emissions at the rate that some of us want to go at. So I think there's a little bit there. We can all agree on the target. How we get there, I think, is where we start to diverge a little bit. But so Labor remains committed to looking at all the ways we can get to the target realistically, supporting people and transparently in how we're going to do that.
That is a good segue, Suzanne, because the next question we did have was about gas. And this question was framed specifically for you, Leanne, but I'll then open up because I think gas is an important topic for everybody. So the question was, I received a Liberals flyer saying that their policy is to overturn the ban on new natural gas connections. What is the Liberals' proposed pathway to eliminating stationary energy emissions in the ACT, given that position?
Gosh, I didn't realise someone would have put out a flyer saying that we would overturn. Can you say that again? What are we doing?
Overturning the ban on new. So we have we're agreed ban
on new suburbs
on natural gas connections by 2035, and it's the position to overturn that ban.
Gosh, I'm unfamiliar that is our actual position. I know that you know, if it is the way that we are getting off gas and onto electricity, I don't think we are committed to a date for that. I believe it needs to be an approach where it's affordable and that everything can cope with that change. But I don't know that we've yeah, I'll have to, I'm unsure, I need to look into that. I don't know who that flyer might have been from, but we certainly, if you know, we need to get people off gas and onto electricity, we need to do that in a way that is manageable for all of Canberrans and for our the current status here in the ACT.
Suzanne, as you raise this issue, maybe I'll go to you as if you have any thoughts on that, or just and on the transition around gas in general, not just about this particular.
Yeah, I think gas I'll talk in general. I think gas in general is one of those ones where it is a little bit trickier because people do seem to be a little bit wedded to gas as an energy source for cooking. Which as someone who has an induction cooktop, I'm not quite sure why, because I think I cook nice food. So I think there's a bit of an educative piece there. Gas was a transition fuel. It's been a transition fuel for a long time, and we need to start that transition and we need to start looking off it. And ACT Labor recognises that. We also acknowledge that there's an educative piece there to make people comfortable with where we're going, so that we're bringing everyone along with us, and also looking at how we can best transition our infrastructure, because it is a bit of a tricky one in making sure, as a planner, again, infrastructure has a long lead time, making sure that we've got it there in place. So as we continue to transition to more electricity and off the gas, just making sure we get all the bits to line up together, so that we keep that social goodwill there to actually partake in the transition, and people aren't sitting in their homes in the middle of winter going, it's really cold, who took away my gas? That's probably all I'll add there, Simon, unless you had a bit more of a specific question I haven't covered.
Oh, no, I think the question was specifically for Leanne, but I just thought give people the opportunity to talk about the transition of gas. And Rebecca, you see your hand up.
Yeah, I thought it would be useful just to talk about a couple of things, particularly picking up on a couple of previous reflections about the plan and also around just transition. So I think that the whole idea about setting a timeline in terms of transitioning off fossil fuel gas is that we have an orderly transition, and there's a heap of work that's been done. I would like just to really acknowledge the leadership of Shane Rattenbury with his role of emissions reduction in terms of developing up the integrated energy plan that really does outlay the plan in terms of we need to look at our electricity system and making sure that our network actually can support the increased electricity that we will need. We need to continue the work to ensure that we have enough renewable electricity, and particularly storage continues to be a really important issue. Government needs to show leadership. So there's been significant work that's been done to look at how we actually transition the assets that we own off gas, and it is like we have actually delivered a health infrastructure with no gas when it was said that there was no way you could do it. We're looking at schools that are now being designed without any gas. So we really need to do that piece of leadership from government. We also need to, we'll transition for new buildings, and the work that I was really proud to announce just a little while ago is a 10-year plan in terms of new buildings, how we ensure that we're actually looking at embodied carbon as well as operational emissions and the whole of life. And so again, that's a 10-year plan that we need to do. But we also need to recognise that some of this stuff will be really tricky, and retrofitting in particular will be really tricky. So again, we need to look at how we support apartment owners, and we've already started some pilot projects in terms of looking at how we deal with that. We need to support apartment owners and strata managers particularly, who are really struggling with this, and particularly getting multiple owners to agree to some of this transition is going to be really difficult. So there's a role for government and government leadership. And I think there's also, you know, talking about the issue of just transition, we really need to ensure that lower income households don't end up being stranded on the gas network. And so, you know, some of the work that the ACT Greens have announced that we, you know, we would do if we had the opportunity, if re-elected, is really looking at how we support low-income households to get off gas, how we actually look at particularly public housing, putting solar panels and infrastructure on all public housing by 2030 to ensure that we reduce emissions and we also reduce cost of living for the lowest income households in our community.
Vanessa?
Yeah, just to kind of jump in here, I think that it's an interesting question because I think it obviously, you know, it raises questions about I haven't seen the flyer, but that kind of a stance would raise questions about how the Liberals would intend to meet long-term climate targets, which I think we've all been talking about trying to meet if they continue to promote essentially what the flyer said. So I think if I can zoom out a little bit and add something different, I think it actually raises a point beyond just this single maybe that specific flyer, in that, you know, it's no wonder voters might be a little bit confused if on the one hand we're saying something and then flyers are being distributed that say something different. And obviously there's a question over which candidate or what exactly was said. But yeah, I think that we need to kind of call out inconsistencies in policy statements, in how it would play out on the ground. And also I think the closer that we get to election time, you know, we do get attack ads, we might sometimes get misleading statements, we get all of these things that shift us away from really genuine good policy conversations. So I think maybe this question shines a light on all of the different messages that are going out and the consistency or otherwise of those. But yeah, I think that in relation to the flyer, I think that, you know, natural gas, we've heard that obviously that's a transition fuel, but it's still a really significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, in the context of ACT's goal by 2045 or earlier, hopefully, to reach zero net emissions, it kind of seems to run counter to that, which then takes us into the territory of maybe inconsistent statements being made. So I think, you know, we need to think about like what is, if we're all on the same page, hopefully it seems about the long-term thing that we're trying to achieve, like what's the most credible pathway to get there, and making sure that everything that we're doing is in alignment to that. And I think we've had really fantastic ideas put forward of in terms of how that could look. And just to echo what Rebecca was saying about having an overarching emphasis on not leaving people behind, not leaving certain individuals, certain households, even certain businesses behind in what we're doing. So yeah, that's my answer.
Can I just add, you know, shots fired. I think it's important to, I'm no expert, but I believe getting off gas isn't the only option to getting us to 2045. Definitely something that we're all working towards. I don't know where the flyer came from. I'm happy to take that, Simon, if you want to send it to me and let me know, and I can certainly find out where that came from. But we are committed to 2045, and there are a range of ways that we can get there, and that's it.
Thank you. Thanks. It's good to have a little bit of back and forth, and that's always healthy part of the democracy and debate, I think. Just a little flag on where we're at with the discussion tonight. We had scheduled this to go till 9, and I think where we're going, you know, we've still probably got maybe 20 minutes worth of questions available time, but we probably won't get to everything. I also understand that's a long night, so I don't want to keep you all here over time. Definitely don't want to do that. So I'll ask a few more questions, but just to flag, I'm sorry for anybody whose questions aren't getting asked tonight, because there was a lot of questions, but the conversation has been good so far. We had one more that was kind of related to on climate change and emissions, which was about transport. And there was a question about what do you plan to do to increase the uptake of EVs further? And is there any thoughts about that? And I'll add a little, you know, element of anything else on transport you'd like to say around emissions. So maybe Suzanne, I'll go with you for this one to start off with.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm not the transport spokesperson, so bear with me.
Understand.
But look, there's a clear commitment from Labor to continue to support the uptake of electric vehicles for the private transport fleet, also to transition our government fleet to electric vehicles, so that we are reducing transport emissions from those. We are looking at transitioning the bus fleet to electric vehicles. We've also got the light rail, obviously runs on renewable electricity. Continuing to look at those options, supporting active travel, and I appreciate some people who are very passionate about active travel would like us to see more, but we'll continue to do what we can do when we can do it, and looking at how we can continue to get people. I mean, I must admit, I did move a motion this last assembly asking for us to look at how we could have a emissions-free zone within the ACT, and I must say, you know, my colleague across the aisles, Mr. Parton, had a pretty good time with this one, and saying how Canberrans don't want to get out of their cars, that they want to be able to drive vehicles that you know do have emissions, and that would be stopping people from travelling through Canberra. And I think that's the kind of discussion we need to move away from, and start looking at how we actually going to have a way that can meet people's transport needs, while we are also looking after our environmental interests of decarbonising that sector of our economy. So Labor will continue to work on how we can do that educative piece, to also put in place the incentives to, excuse the pun, but to drive change across our transport areas, and to make sure that people can also move around the city the way they need to, with things such as 20-minute timed schedules between bus routes and so forth. So every bus coming every 20 minutes. That's what I'm trying to say. So those are the things we're looking at. How can we improve the transport network for everyone? How can we make sure it's done in a way that's environmentally friendly? And how can we not scare people in the process so that they'll get on board?
Thanks, Suzanne. Rebecca?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think it's really exciting what we've seen in terms of the uptake of EVs here in the ACT. And I think some of the incentives that we have had in place, including support through the Sustainable Household Scheme, has been something that has really supported that work. And we do think that there's probably some more work that we need to do, particularly for low-income households. So we are proposing to introduce a $4,000 rebate to help low-income renters and apartment residents to purchase an EV, to really, again, to ensure that we are doing that just transition. A lot of the work has really, been in terms of how we support EV uptake, particularly around charging infrastructure. And we think particularly with apartments that have already been built, thankfully, we've actually driven change at the national level for new apartments, that they'll at least have to rough in infrastructure for EV charging for new apartments, but we will have a significant, challenge in terms of existing apartments. So part of the answer to that will be public charging infrastructure. And so, while we've seen a significant increase in that infrastructure across the city, with more than 100 new charging stations across the city, we do think that we will commit to installing banks of DC fast chargers, particularly in town centres and in the parliamentary triangle. And we actually think that it will be a really good idea to deliver 2 solar covered car parks with battery storage and EV charging. So that's a really, something a little bit different, and some innovative thinking. Again, we see the absolute importance around active transport and ensuring the infrastructure is there. It is great to finally see the rolling out of the Garden City route, but it's taken a long time to go, and there's plenty of other areas of our active travel route that we need to look at, particularly around specific infrastructure for cycling. It's quite positive to see that there seems to be some consensus building in terms of the work that we need to do around public transport, particularly buses, and the fact that we need to just ensure that we deliver a reliable and a consistent service to really encourage people to get on public transport. And I think there's quite a lot of agreement in terms of how we really need to get to a 20-minute service during the week. There's a little bit of difference, I think, in terms of on the weekend, and there's agreements around with a couple of us in terms of providing free transport, particularly for concession holders and young people under the age of 18. Again, we see light rail as absolutely part of the story. We do support the rolling out of light rail, and frankly, we just think it should be happening faster. with the first stage being delivered in 4 years, and the second stage they're talking about 17 years. It's just not quick enough in terms of the urgent issues that we are facing around climate change. So we just need to get on with the job more quickly.
Vanessa, I'll go to you on this one.
Yeah, sure. Just to echo, I again, you know, I'm in the Brindabella electorate, and absolutely it's not happening enough. Like at the moment, buses have been cut and the tram might make it there in a very many years. And so I think we need more accessible and kind of urgent options that allow for more connectivity. But yeah, I think we're really excited about the uptake of EVs, but yeah, I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of making it accessible, affordable, and convenient for everybody. And I think, you know, the starting point before we get to thinking about the technicalities of charging stations and, you know, what type of EV and those sorts of questions, I think, you know, it really needs to start with public awareness and education. And I think that Suzanne was touching on this because I think, yeah, we've had a lot of kind of early adopters who have enthusiastically kind of jumped on the bandwagon. But as with any innovation that starts to spread, it can also essentially stop if we don't reach the kind of middle ground or even the laggards. And for that to happen, it needs to be that, you know, we move beyond people feeling slightly unsure about the benefits, which I think a lot of people at the moment still are. And so I think that we need to be investing in and rolling out some really good kind of educational and awareness campaigns. But then, yeah, it does come down to things like, you know, charging infrastructure, thinking about things like public charging stations, fast chargers along major routes. I think that this goes to the awareness. Again, you know, people might have kind of anxiety to do with charging, which is sort of, you know, we can overcome that with the right technical solutions along with the awareness building at the same time. I think incentives for EV purchase are massive, especially with making sure that, again, as Rebecca was touching on, like low to middle income households, making sure that people have the right support to actually make the switch that we're asking them to make, essentially. Even things like encouraging fleet transitions. Like I know that in the UK and in a number of countries where the adoption has been really widespread, it's often been underpinned by a really good uptake at the fleet level. So I think not just thinking about individual potential owners of EVs, but also thinking about incentives and ways of making it easier for fleets to transition, thinking about the secondhand EV market as well. And yeah, so basically it's a multi-pronged sort of a strategy. And I think that, while we're seeing some good uptake here and we're making great strides, I think Australia as a whole has kind of lagged behind a little bit with EVs. And the silver lining of that, I guess, is that there are some really exciting things and initiatives that we've seen overseas that have been tested and rolled out. So I think that we need to also think about what's worked really well elsewhere, what kind of incentives, but then tailor it to the ACT context. But yeah, sort of as was touched on, we also think it's not just about EVs. We're very big on active travel, as I touched on at the start, thinking about cycling lanes and things like that. But also restoring, especially out in Tuggeranong, you know, buses have been cut. We need to think about really immediate connectivity options for people. A lot of people who at the moment feel quite disconnected from their own community. So multi-pronged kind of approach, and hopefully weaving in the evidence on what's worked elsewhere in this. But as Rebecca was saying, I think, you know, on the whole, it's really exciting, this space, and there's so much more that can be done.
Thanks, Leanne. I'll turn to you on EVs and transport.
Great. I feel this is the question I'm totally going to fail Mr. Mark Parton. He's, you know, all up in the transport policy. And I would encourage you to, I've just hopped online to the freshopportunity.org where our whole transport policy is outlined there. I think it's whole 32 pages of it. But the key for us is making sure we transition that bus fleet to electric buses. I think we're all on the same page here. You know, we see the buses, one of 106. We know, I think we've only got 6 of them or something like that. We need to get more of those happening and retire that old fleet, making sure all buses have bike racks on them, encouraging Canberrans to take up transport, public transport. I've had to grab our flyer as well, I'm sorry, and I'm struggling to read in the dark, but making sure people can catch public transport when they need to get to where they need to go is crucial. And love it or hate it, we would love to try and see if we can bring an industry here where we do build the buses here in Canberra. It has happened in other jurisdictions similar to the ACT, and I think that's the sort of bold decisions and you know, visionary decisions we need to make for Canberra if we're serious about this. With regard to electric vehicles, I think expanding that second-hand market is crucial. There's no way my kids could afford to get themselves an EV. They're, 27 and one's a roofer, and my daughter's 22. At the moment, that's not in their reality. So we have to look at what that looks like for Canberra and how we can make more opportunities there for for people to purchase electric vehicles. And then also, this is probably unpopular opinion, but my partner has a business in staging, sound, lighting. So he has a 9-meter stage trailer that he has to tow. There's no option for him at the moment to get out of his petrol vehicle, and I'm worried, and I know businesses in my electorate are worried when they hear, about the bans with regard to the fuel vehicles. So I think for that purpose, there has to be a more of a gently approach, so that people don't panic, pack up and leave Canberra with their businesses and move across the border. I think it's important until we have all of the options that we need in order to truck the stuff where we need to truck it. And, we have many four-wheel drives here that, probably not all of us need our four-wheel drives, but there are real legitimate businesses in town that don't have an option to get into an electric vehicle yet. So, and for those people, I think we need to still support them in any way we can.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to touch base on transport, which is one of the big, climate carbon emitters, and it's good to hear some diversity of views on that. Look, I've got 2 more questions for folks before we wrap up. I think not every question we're going to get to, but I also appreciate it's getting a bit late. So just 2 on one that's was on our list, and one that we've had someone's asked me in the chat tonight. But I think the one on the list that I think people will be interested on, which is a hot topic in the ACT always, and it's what is your policy on kangaroo culling? And there was a specific question to you, Leanne, again around this, because I believe there's a proposal to pause or halt the kangaroo cull, and a question about why that might be the case. But I would like to hear everybody's view on this particular hot topic, which is one that I think is a constant debate in the ACT. So maybe, Leanne, I'll hand to you first on that one, if that's okay.
Everybody's favourite question this week. So
yeah.
Yes, we have committed to a moratorium on kangaroo management, on the kangaroo management plan. Basically, overwhelming feedback from the community with the concern about the program's lack of transparency and allegations of unacceptable animal cruelty. Now, the moratorium will only apply to government-run kangaroo management programs, so not to culls undertaken on private land and farmers. We discussed that at length on Monday, and I know that is some massive concern for farmers, and coming from a farming background myself, completely understand their concern. Now, the moratorium that we've set will last no longer than 12 months, but we do want to complete an independent review as quickly as possible, so that the program can be restarted, in a transparent and humane manner. I think the community is rightfully concerned. It's awful, the term clubbing joeys has been bandied about a lot. There has to be a better way, and so the Canberra Liberals really want to reform the cull into a humane model. So I want the review to consider the feasibility of expanding fertility darting, but that's something I don't know a lot about, but it's certainly been raised with us many times, and I would like to see what the outcome of that is. So that's it.
Vanessa, I might hand to you if you have any.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that this is probably something for which independents might have different perspectives, maybe on the how exactly it should look, but I think that we all kind of try to take an evidence-based approach, and I think that nobody would argue with having a more balanced and more humane approach if we can. So yeah, I just to flag that I think that I'm speaking independently on this one, and other people may have different opinions, but I mean, my own thoughts on this would be to try to shift towards more ethical and ensuring that we're having evidence-based solutions. And yeah, I think that there might be some alternatives that can be explored. So there's research about fertility control, ecological restoration, fencing and other non-lethal deterrence, monitoring. Like I think that there's a whole strand of potential ways to go about it. I think there are different consultations and things that have happened. I'm not sure that we've harnessed all of the community voices that we need to in this space as well. I think that I really strongly don't feel that we've landed on the best approach, essentially, but I think we need to turn to the evidence and the science to try to come up with that and make sure that it's collaborative and that different voices are heard. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, just in saying that, like the goal would be to, consistent with everything that we've said, like trying to both protect our native species and ecosystem, whilst also respecting the welfare of kangaroos. So that would be my kind of overarching goal. And I think that we could invest in different alternatives, but I know that there are some challenges with those alternatives, and there are questions over which alternative is the best one. And I would also say that, you know, immediate population pressures obviously can still require intervention, which can obviously equate to kangaroo culling. But I think the long term, I would say that the long term goal should be to try to make sure that we're using the most sustainable and ethical practices. But in the short term, obviously, we've got pressures that need to be taken into account. So that is my individual view, and different independents may have different views on that. But yeah, overarching, I think it hopefully is consistent with everybody, all of the things that have been said about trying to respect, trying to protect our species, and but also it comes down to a welfare question at the same time. So yeah.
Suzanne, I might hand to you on this one.
So ACT Labor does not have any intention of changing the current approach to kangaroo culling in the ACT, noting that approach currently is to balance the environmental concerns with animal welfare. So it's also to look at how we can continue to improve the program so it's more humane. So while we continue with the environmental ambitions of the program, we also will continue to look for ways that we can do it as humanely as possible.
And Rebecca, to end with you.
Thank you. Look, this is an issue that I have engaged with very deeply over the last 4 years. Vanessa spoke a lot about evidence, and Leanne talked about an independent review. So I would point both of those candidates to the independent review of the kangaroo management plan that has been undertaken by a very respected ecologist, Professor Legg, that examined all aspects of the management plan, including all of the research, the methodology, the past outcomes, and the appropriateness of culling kangaroos for conservation outcomes. She found that the program is an outstanding example of adaptive management. There was really useful recommendations in there that are being incorporated into the next kangaroo management plan. There is no doubt that kangaroo management is really confronting. It's a really difficult thing. And, you know, as someone who's had to oversee the program, I wish that I didn't have to do it. But when we look at the evidence and we look at what we are trying to protect in terms of precious habitat and ecological communities, it is clear that we have to do kangaroo management. This is not kangaroos' fault. This is a situation that has been created by humans. And certainly when we look at the fact that we have isolated kangaroo populations, if we do not manage these, we will create significant issues for kangaroos as well as for the ecosystems that they're operating in. In terms of the animal welfare practices that are put in place, again, Professor Legg found that they were the most humane practices that could be met. There is absolutely a conversation to be had in terms of how we actually support, the movement of wildlife throughout the city. And I think that if, we do need to look at things such as, how we support things such as land bridges. The issue of what is happening with it, there's a lot of attention that's given to the the kangaroo management that happens on government land that is actually highly scrutinised. And so it's sort of interesting that the Liberal Party is saying that they'll stop that program, where we look at, you know, what might be happening in, you know, other areas. And we know certainly in other jurisdictions, the things that are happening are really disturbing and problematic. But there's about 200 animals per year that are managed through the cull program. There's up to 4,000 animals that are hit by cars every year. And so, you know, the animal welfare impacts for those animals is something that I think we really need to spend some more time on. We need to look at some of the opportunities around things such as virtual fencing, land bridges, and how we actually, you know, reduce that impact. But any party that turns up and says that they are supportive of environmental protection and don't follow the evidence and don't actually look at, you know, what needs to be done from a whole of ecology perspective is not being genuine in terms of their credentials around environmental protection and conservation. Other methodologies such as Gonacon that we have actually brought, the fertility program that we have brought in to the current program, is a useful complementary program which will reduce the need for culling in the longer term. At this point is only a complementary program. Unfortunately, it works best in contained populations and can't be done at a landscape level. So I would just really encourage candidates and other members to really look at the evidence and actually, you know, recognise that while some of the things that we need to do are really confronting, because of the issues that humans have created, that we still need to show some leadership in this area.
Thanks, everyone. I knew that would be a controversial topic. Look, I've had one question that's just come through the chat that I'll just flag with folks. I imagine that there might not be much. People might not be able to answer it straight off because it's come through the chat. But I'll just flag it, ask this, and see if anyone's got any thoughts on this. And the question was, I know it's TCCS's responsibility, that's Transport Canberra City Services, but when will we have effective collection and processing of soft plastics? Sending them to landfill is not an acceptable solution. Does any candidate have any thought on and this is about the Coles and Woolies used to collect soft plastics, but they don't do that anymore. Is there any plans or thoughts about the collection of soft plastics? And Suzanne, you've popped your camera on. Do you want to?
Yeah, I've tried to give you this subtle hint and you got it, Simon.
Yeah.
Look, I can't talk extensively to this because it does sit within TCCS, but it is a conversation I've been having with the Minister for City Services because it does come up as an environmental issue, obviously with plastic, huge environmental problem. It is a trickier one. It's one that we're looking for a national solution to, and it is one that's being discussed between states and territories. It's definitely still I'd like to give people assurances that it is actively being progressed and looked at how we can actually get a good response that continues to provide for that. There's no shortage of things that we can look to better reduce, reuse, recycle. The other one that I'm really keen on is textiles recycling, not unrelated to plastics, given how many synthetics there are within clothing these days. And that's something too that Labor is looking at how we can actually get a bit more of a textiles recycling program here in the ACT. So can't go into all the detail. Happy to get back to you in the future, Simon, if you want a little bit more. But yes, it's certainly something Labor is looking at and committed to doing a good response on.
Anybody else want to say anything, Rebecca?
Yeah, look, I can chip in a little bit. Given that some of the national work has actually happened through environment ministers' meetings, which I've been supporting the responsible minister on, and certainly product stewardship is a really important issue. We do have a real challenge with the fact that most of the product stewardship programs, and textiles is a good example, Suzanne, that it is currently a voluntary program. They are certainly on notice in terms of if they don't up their game, that it will become a compulsory thing. But certainly we do need to look at product stewardship. I think we need to recognise that the soft plastic recycling that we thought was happening actually wasn't happening. And so, in fact, they were just stockpiling and they weren't recycling. However, I think as we are looking at establishing a new recycling centre after we very unfortunately lost our current recycling centre. This is something that really does need to be built into the specs. There are technologies in terms of looking at soft plastics. We are absolutely looking at a new recycling centre right now. So we need to be looking at that issue as part of that process, and how we actually support Canberrans to ensure that we're not sending this stuff to landfill.
Leanne or
I have nothing to say on this one. I'm sorry, it's just not something that I recollect coming up yet. I can let people know if it's part of that policy platform. I'll chat with Nicole.
I think my thoughts would just be to say, I think there's no doubt about the importance of this. I think that any solution, again, will be sort of multi-pronged. So I'm extremely pleased, as I think everybody on the call would be, to hear that there's some progress underway and a lot of different, like, really tangible ideas have been put forward, and a lot of those will go hand in hand together. As for the question of when it might happen, this will be maybe a slightly biased answer, but I think that getting independents as many elected as possible in the election will be really important, because I think in the lead up to election, but also afterwards, when we go back to kind of business as usual, we can often see a crowding out of genuine progress on the environmental front. And I think, as we've seen elsewhere with independents elected in different jurisdictions, I think having a really strong kind of environmentally focused crossbench has made a massive difference. So I think that we will be able to help to continue shining a light on the importance of pushing forward with progress, but really great to hear that things are already underway on that front. So yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry, I was just responding to a chat in the message in the chat. So thank you, everybody. I think, look, it's 10 to 9, so I reckon this is probably a good time to wrap up and let everybody go. I know that all candidates will be working very hard and having lots of long nights and talking to lots of constituents and members of the community at the moment, and so you're probably all ready for a good sleep, maybe. But I wanted to say thank you all very much for coming tonight and for giving up your time to talk about these really important issues. It's really great to hear this, to hear the diversity of views, to be talking about the importance of the environment. And we all recognise how important this is in our community, and there's some really great discussions here that have happened. I want to say thank you to all the people who have sat and listened. I appreciate that this wasn't the most interactive conversation tonight, but it was a good way to get all of these answers out. One quick wrap up, and I'm just popping this into the chat now, is obviously for everybody here, we continue at the Conservation Council to do really important work in advocating for our environment, and this is part of that, but the work will continue after the election as well. With whoever gets elected, we'll be working with them as closely as possible to do the best work we can possibly to protect our environment, to reduce carbon emissions, to continue advocating for these policies. Our election platform doesn't stop on election day. It's our position that we'll be continuing to push. Even if some parties don't agree to accept, doing it all, you'll be hearing from us if you haven't accepted some parts of it. We'll be continuing to push you to do so. But I just wanted to encourage everyone here to have a quick look at a few things. So you can have a look at our election platform and contact candidates about issues that are really of concern for you. You can see our full election platform there if you want to see more detail of that. It's actually quite a detailed document, over 30 pages, I think, with some really detailed asks. But we also need support in the work that we do. And so we ask that, if you have a chance, if you have the ability to help us continue to do this important work, make a donation to the Conservation Council. We talked about funding struggles at the start of this conversation, and every donation is really, really helpful in allowing us to continue to do our work. Or you could join our newsletter and find out more, or volunteer for us. We're always looking for volunteers to be working on these key policy issues in our core campaigns. So there's some links there in the chat of those 3 things. If you'd like to do any of those 3 things, we'd really appreciate it. Please get in touch and get involved in protecting our environment. We can't all do this alone, and we can't expect all the politicians to do it by themselves either. We have to do it as a partnership, and that means not just me as the executive director, but me with an army of volunteers is how we become much, much stronger. So please consider getting involved. But otherwise, I want to just say a big thank you to Suzanne, Vanessa, Rebecca, and Leanne. We really appreciate you taking the time. Good luck with all of your, I guess, the sanity in the next 4 weeks, I think is maybe the best way to say it. We hope you all survive. We hope you stay well. Election campaigns are really tough. And so I hope you all get through to the end and keep talking about these important issues. So thank you all very much for coming along and taking the time.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.